is with the videographer?
We have 30 seconds.
He has to change.
Are you all set?
No, hand me 30 seconds.
He needs to change page.
Oh,
Proceedings, the evidence has made clear that Cameron Aubrey is no more than a sweatshop entrepreneur. Today, the prosecution has satisfied their burden of proof as to count 1, human trafficking, a felony beyond any reasonable doubt. Those elements include 1, that the defendant deprived and violated someone of their personal liberty, and 2, when the defendant acted, they intended on obtaining or maintaining forced labor. Today, we heard Ms. Stark working for 4 months, 90-hour work weeks at Taste of Tantera as the restaurant's only chef for next to no pay. Her pay was determined by Cameron Aubrey, who gave her a measly $2.29 an hour, disturbingly under minimum wage laws. We also heard Ms. Stark testify to her room that the defendant made sure was inside the restaurant. This room was cramped and filthy and had bars on the window, just like a prison cell. Now, let's look at the specific legal means of how the defendant deprived Lynn of her personal liberty. We heard from Julian Blake that the defendant threatened to dock Lynn's pay if she did not work faster. Ms. Stark testified to being under severe anxiety and depression just a few months working into the restaurant. Now, it is clear that Lynn's will was overborne. On March 10th, she handwrote a note and delivered it to Officer West. On it, it read, "Please help me. I'm being treated like a slave." This is the precise mentality that the defendant would have wanted. A victim so fearful that she stayed at Taste of Tantera against her own will. As our expert witness, Dana Greyjoy, who interviewed Lynn just one day after employment, she concluded that Lynn had clear signs of a human trafficking victim. On the other hand, Addison Frey didn't have her interview with Lynn until a month after the defendant's arrest and considered Cameron's blatant threats as Lynn misconstruing the defendant's feedback, making her opinion unreliable. We also have duress. Under Calcom 1243, all the prosecution needs to prove is that the defendant knowingly possessed Lynn Stark's passport, which caused a reasonable person to do something they otherwise would not have done. On March 9th, Lynn asked for her passport back, but the defendant angrily refused, saying that she could not leave the restaurant under any circumstances. Thus, Lynn could not go back to her family in Tantera, but instead stayed at the restaurant against her own will, hence doing something she otherwise would not have done. Now, let's take a look at the defendant's intent. To obtain Lynn's labor, she made sure that she was the only one in charge of the employment process by rejecting Julian Blake's assistance. She went into the hiring process with her old boss's strategy in mind, to get a lot out of the workers for a little cost. Knowing that her inheritance was not enough to cover the cost of a restaurant, Cameron Aubrey still went through in the hiring process, knowing that this vulnerable Tantaran immigrant could be manipulated into working hours at a time for next to no pay. Now, in regards to maintaining Lynn's forced labor, let's take a look at the statement the defendant made on March 7th. Right after Officer West mentions that Cameron Aubrey is abusive towards her cook, the defendant snapped and remarked, "I don't know who you think you are, but you need to understand something. Everything under that roof is mine. Everything." Lynn was mere property to the defendant, just another piece of kitchen equipment. Just 2 days later, Lynn Stark asked the defendant for her passport back so she could go visit her dying sister. The defendant angrily refused this and told her that she could not leave under any circumstances. Thus, it was clear that the defendant was going to do whatever it takes to maintain Lynn's forced labor, which would include depriving her of her personal liberty, depriving her of her government documentation, and slamming self-locking doors. Which brings us to the next count, false imprisonment. Those elements include 1, that the defendant intentionally and unlawfully restrained someone, and 2, the defendant's act made someone stay somewhere against their will. Miss Aubrey admitted to being frustrated by the events of the recent days on March 9th, which would include her interaction with Officer Hayden West. She went into Lynn's room that same day with the mindset of being angry and took Lynn Stark's key. We know this because Frankie Lyman testified that she saw the defendant go in and out of Lynn's room hours before the incident. Cameron was going to show Lynn that everything under that roof was hers. After realizing she was detained in her own room, Miss Stark was slamming and screaming and sobbing and banging on the door for someone to let her out. The defendant mockingly opens the door, asking, "Missing your key?" Your Honor, today the prosecution has satisfied their burden of proof, casting aside her role as an aspiring restaurateur and assuming the role of a sweatshop entrepreneur. Today, we request that you rule justly tonight and find Cameron Aubrey guilty on both counts, human trafficking and false imprisonment.
All right, thank you, counsel. I'll hear from the defense.
Yes, Your Honor. May I inquire as to the time remaining?
The defense has 6 minutes and 1 second left for closing statements.
Thank you. May I proceed?
You may.
Your Honor, the prosecution has just portrayed Cameron Aubrey as a sweatshop entrepreneur whose goal and plan was to enslave Miss Stark. However, this is not the truth in this case. The defense has brought you the truth, Your Honor, and the truth is that Miss Aubrey genuinely cared for her employees. And her goals in hiring Miss Stark were to gain a reliable employee who could cook authentic Tantaran cuisine, but more importantly, to provide Miss Stark with the opportunity to pursue her American dream. Miss Aubrey's actions and behavior is not that of a human trafficker. Your Honor, in my client's youth, she went to Tantara and did humanitarian work there, and ever since then, she has respected the Tantaran culture and its people, including Miss Stark. Also, while Miss Stark was employed at Taste of Tantara, the defendant gave her free room, free food, and money for personal items. Never once did my client prevent Miss Stark from leaving, from taking a break, or from going completely outside the restaurant. Also, my client may have given constructive criticism to Lynn Stark, but this was no more harsh than any type of constructive criticism given to her other employees. None of these facts show that Miss Aubrey treated Miss Stark like a slave. If anything, they show that she treated Lynn Stark like a family member. Also, Miss Aubrey never once had the intention of obtaining forced labor from Miss Stark. Miss Aubrey worked as hard or harder than Miss Stark at Taste of Tantara. So the argument is flawed that she would intend to obtain forced labor from Miss Stark, unless, of course, she also intended to obtain forced labor from herself. Moving on to false imprisonment. It is true that on March 9th, my client did close the self-locking door to Lynn Stark's apartment. However, she did not intend to confine Miss Stark to the room. Her mind was not on the unusual self-locking door. Her mind was elsewhere. It was on Miss Stark's unreasonable request for a vacation. It was on the frustrating events of the past few days. Her mind was not on any intent whatsoever to confine a person in any area. Also, there is no evidence that my client's act of closing the door even caused Ms. Stark to stay in the room. The prosecution guesses, the prosecution speculates that my client stole Ms. Stark's key. However, this story does not add up. The only time my client could have potentially taken the key was on March 9th. However, there's an interesting timeline of events here. She would have had to have taken the key during the day on March 9th. However, the only time that she would have any even remote reason to confine someone to the restaurant was when they asked to leave. Miss Stark asked to leave that evening. So she would have had to have known ahead of time, that day, that there would be an argument that night for which she would need, potentially, to lock someone in the room. However, this was not even her intention. However, this does show that even if Your Honor does find that she had a reason to confine Miss Stark, she had no way to know that the key would have to have been taken. Therefore, this proves that the key was not taken and remained in the apartment, or Miss Stark had it the entire time. There is yet more evidence that shows that my client is not guilty of either charge. Miss Stark may have misinterpreted my client's actions and statements because of her inexperience as an immigrant from Tantera. What my client may have said or done could have easily been misinterpreted, misconstrued by Miss Stark, and therefore, what may have been encouraging came across as coercive. When she wanted Miss Stark to continue working, she wanted to encourage Miss Stark, not to further enslave her. In this case, as in every case, the prosecution has the very heavy burden of proof of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that my client is guilty of human trafficking and false imprisonment. As I'm sure Your Honor knows, the phrase beyond a reasonable doubt is very important. Your Honor, if we have accomplished
30
nothing
seconds.
else, the defense has at least shown that there is reasonable doubt in this case. The prosecution has failed to prove either count. All they have succeeded in doing is falsely accusing a woman who wanted to be a successful business owner of 2 crimes she did not commit. My client only wanted to run a successful business and give Ms. Stark the opportunity to pursue the American dream.
Stop.
All right, thank you, counsel. Will you rebuttal from the prosecution?
Yes, Your Honor. Cameron Aubrey's restaurant dreams involved violating Lynn Stark's personal liberties. She used fear to restrict Lynn from taking any breaks at the restaurant. She constantly berated Lynn. She yelled at Lynn. She even threatened Lynn that she could get deported back to Tantera if she didn't work faster. Your Honor, conspicuously absent from the defense's closing arguments was the defendant's use of duress. This is simply because this is an obvious mean. We proved it in cross-examination, and Cameron Aubrey did possess Lynn Stark's passport, thus satisfying the mean of human trafficking. Now, the defendant didn't have to know that an argument would ensue on March 9th. This is because Lynn's actions were controlled by her. She had one apartment in the restaurant with the only other key in her possession. She knew that she would have gone there to go to sleep because that's all she had to go in the world. Stop.
All right, rebuttal from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Yes.
As to the potential duress in this case, my client explicitly stated her intentions in having Miss Stark's visa and passport. She intended to renew them to allow Miss Stark to stay in the United States. Now, the prosecution may well have proven today, that Miss Aubrey was a bad boss. But that is not what she's on trial for tonight, Your Honor. She is on trial for human trafficking and false imprisonment. And being a poor employer is not
30 seconds.
an element of either crime. The prosecution has failed to prove a story that is any more reasonable than ours. Therefore, you must choose the side that points to the defendant's innocence. We respectfully request 2 verdicts of not guilty. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, counsel.